Story: The Spooky Red Blanket. Its fabric is smooth and silky, the threads glistening like droplets of water, and it has a very pure, sparkling red color. Each embroidered pattern on it is so intricate, evoking a heart-wrenching love story soaked in tears. It's these patterns that made Huon determined to acquire it. Huon only remembered he was talking to an elderly woman of the ethnic minority, around 60 years old, with a weathered face full of wrinkles. The woman's teeth were darkened, her mouth chewing on something red, dripping in her mouth. Huon was sure that the thing the woman was chewing wasn't betel nut, a common treat at weddings. It was the flesh of some animal, though Huon couldn't be certain which. Standing before her, he only felt a pungent smell emanating from the woman, a repulsive odor that made everyone want to stay away from her, originating from the foul meat she was chewing. If Huon hadn't been so enamored with the red blanket displayed outside her door, he probably wouldn't have endured standing in front of the woman for so long. Until the woman muttered something in response, Huon felt relieved, thinking he had succeeded in this transaction. The woman spoke in a native language Huon didn't understand, only gesturing for him to follow her inside, motioning for Huon to follow. Huon was anxious. It was already late, his travel party of dozens had left this remote village to return to Dien Bien province. Yet, he lingered here, distancing himself from his group. If he didn't catch up soon, he'd have to spend the night alone in his camping tent by the roadside. But his fascination with the red blanket was overwhelming. He patiently followed the elderly woman. As the sun had set, the landscape was engulfed in darkness, the deserted village covered in shadows. In the daytime, it was beautiful, with lush terraced fields and occasional breezes carrying the scent of leaves, accompanied by birdsong. At nightfall, the surroundings were draped in an eerie silence. Amidst the desolate hills stood the solitary house of the elderly woman, the trail leading to it barely discernible. This place was so remote that there wasn't even the faintest glimmer of electric light. Following the woman into the house, Huon noticed the darkness inside. She didn't light any lamps, seemingly accustomed to living in perpetual darkness. The woman's house was a small, old-style wooden house, barely 5 square meters. It was so small that Huon had never seen anything like it before. Outside, it was adorned with tall poles, draped with colorful, rough fabric, looking peculiar. Since arriving, Huon felt a chilling atmosphere. Perched on a desolate hill, surrounded by thick cornfields, the house was almost entirely hidden from view. If not for Huon's curiosity to explore, to depart from his group, he wouldn't have been here to converse with the elderly woman or to lay eyes on that intriguing red blanket. The trail was so long that it took Huon half a day to traverse it, and the farther he went, the more he felt a profound sense of isolation, as if he had entered a completely different world. "Madam," Huon's voice echoed loudly in the darkness. Inside the house, it was pitch black, and he couldn't see anything anymore. Growing impatient with the lack of response, Huon considered turning back to illuminate the inside with his motorcycle's headlights. But as he turned, his eyes were met with a blur. What he saw were big, round red eyes, a vague face in the darkness, and the stench filled his nostrils. Huon exclaimed, "Oh!" Before he could react further, his mind went blank. When Huon came to, he found himself alone in this predicament, surrounded by mist. Looking down, he realized he was wrapped in a blanket, the very same red blanket he had inquired about earlier. Touching his head, he felt a dull ache and a sense that it had been struck, causing it to swell. But as he examined it, he felt only smoothness, no bump or swelling. It seemed his pain was merely an illusion. Huon staggered to his feet, clutching the red blanket in his arms. Despite the pain he felt, he couldn't suppress his fascination because, in the end, he had finally obtained it as he desired. Running his fingers over the red blanket, he gently stroked it against his face, feeling its smoothness and satisfaction to the extreme. The blanket was as soft as skin, so soft that it felt like pressing his face against a woman's chest. Huon paid no heed to the strange sensation the blanket brought, nor did he feel any difference. It was just a familiar warmth. The feeling the red blanket evoked was unlike any other ordinary blanket, only sheer roughness. Yet, its sensation resembled the smooth, soft, resilient touch of a young woman's bosom, passionately pressing against Huon's face. Holding the blanket in his hand, Huon examined it closely. This red blanket was approximately 2 meters long and 8 meters wide, made of top-quality fabric that no modern fabric production technology could match. Its faint scent was like that of a youthful maiden, stirring Huan's heart. After a long sigh, Huan suddenly remembered he needed to return to the town of Nam Nun. Huan didn't know how long he had been unconscious, only realizing it was dark when he lost consciousness, and now the surroundings were slightly brighter. At least one night had passed while Huan was unconscious. The mist obscured his vision, and all Huan had on him was an empty backpack with some dry rations. He chose a direction, hoping to get out of the mist, find a trail, and leave this place. Initially, Huan felt no worry or fear. He had the unwavering faith of youthful enthusiasm. Nowhere was without a path. He ended up here after fainting, which meant the old woman of the ethnic group had brought him here, so there must be a way for her to return. The only thing that puzzled Huan was why the old woman made him unconscious and left him here, and moreover, she placed the red blanket he asked to buy on him. It showed her concern for the cold weather here, so she brought this blanket to keep Huan warm. However, Huan was unclear about her intentions. The last image Huan saw was terrifyingly wide-open eyes, a foul-smelling mouth oozing a red, malodorous liquid. That terrifying face appeared just as Huan lost consciousness, and Huan somewhat guessed that face belonged to the old woman of the ethnic group from whom Huan had inquired about the red blanket. But now, the further Huan went, the more he felt like he had stumbled into a deep forest. The mist gradually dissipated, and he realized he had arrived in a hellish place. A place not for human beings but reserved for demons. A puddle of fresh, pitch-black blood with scattered remnants gathered into a streak, like the fluid of some creature. Huan touched the puddle, feeling disgusted to the core. What was that? He wondered. Huan stuffed the blanket into the backpack on his back and quickly withdrew his foot from the red, viscous puddle. With a little more walking, the surroundings began to change. The horrifying things Huan had never seen before started to appear. Hidden behind the dense, sprawling fog was now a massive, imposing castle. The most terrifying thing that made Huan's throat dry was that this castle was built of bones, white human bones. Huan wondered where this place was. Wasn't he in a house at the end of a trail? Where had the old, terrifying ethnic woman thrown him, ultimately? Where was the path that could lead him back? Huan tried to suppress his revulsion and walked forward. He began to look up at the bone-built castle, his hands slowly touching a bone. Strangely, when his hands touched the bone, it crumbled into a pile of dust, as if the bone had existed here endlessly. Then, like a domino effect, the entire castle built of bones directly collapsed into powder, dust flying in the air. Just a gentle touch from Huan's hand had completely destroyed the majestic structure of a castle. He couldn't believe what his eyes had just seen. He blinked for a moment and almost woke up because at some point, he had returned to the old house on the hilltop, and he now held the red blanket in his hand. The motorcycle was still there, as if the recent events had happened entirely in his imagination. Huan wondered what had happened. He looked around in confusion, only to find that the old woman's horrifying ethnic house had disappeared, as if it had never existed. Just like the bone castle he had destroyed, clearly seen before his eyes, but ultimately not real. So where had the old woman's house gone? She herself as well? Surely it couldn't be something he imagined because the evidence was still very clear. The red blanket was still here, and Huan still held it in his hand. After searching for a while, Huan found no other differences. In the end, he had to shake his head, thinking that the events he had just experienced were just a figment of his imagination. The backpack still hung on the motorcycle seat, the headlight shining toward the end of the hill, all covered in cornfields. Huan got on the motorcycle, turned back to the old road to go to the highway, back to the town of Nam Nun. As soon as he reached the highway, Huan saw a large displacement motorcycle speeding by, then suddenly it stopped, turned around, and ran close to Huan. A female voice rang out. "Huan, where are you going? That makes the whole team worry so much. We thought you were lost somewhere, so we split up to find." Huan looked closely and immediately recognized Lian, the youngest sister in this expedition. Huan chuckled. "Oh, I saw a beautiful trail, so I turned to see. Let's go back since everyone's worried." Lian felt a bit puzzled but nodded. Then she sped off ahead, leading the way. The town of Nam Nun in Lai Chau Province is the closest administrative unit to China throughout the province and is also a place with many pristine and beautiful landscapes that few people know about. Huan's expedition team this time consisted of a total of 12 people, all of whom agreed to meet after visiting all the places in the town of Nam Nun, to have a final meal together. Then they would return to Dien Bien province to visit the bunker of General Christian de Castries, known to the Vietnamese as the Dien Bien Phu bunker, and finally end the half-month journey to visit the northwest region to return to Hanoi. 30 more minutes passed, and Huan, along with Lian, was less than 15 kilometers away from the town of Nam Nun. Two people met their backpacking group at a deserted bend of the boulevard. This bend had seen its fair share of accidents due to poor visibility. Leading the backpacking group this time was Tien, a young PhD in archaeology. Apart from his passion for archaeology, Tien also loved exploring scenic spots. Upon hearing of Huan's disappearance, Tien had previously sent 4 people to search for him, and finally, Lian, the 5th person, had managed to find him. Seeing Huan return, Tien breathed a sigh of relief and said, "I thought you were dead somewhere. Where did you go?" Scratching his head, Huan seemed embarrassed and suddenly remembered something. "Everyone, I found something. Look." Remembering the red blanket, Huan handed it to Tien, Lian, and the 8 people in the group who were present. Seeing Huan pull out a shiny red blanket, Lian immediately felt delighted and exclaimed, "Oh, this blanket is beautiful. Where did you find it?" Standing next to Lian, Tien furrowed his brows continuously as he seemed to be pondering something while observing Huan pulling out the red blanket. Seeing everyone asking about the history of the blanket, Huan didn't hesitate. He said, "It's strange, really. I found it in a house belonging to an ethnic woman at the end of the trail I followed. But somehow, when I held this blanket, I fainted. When I woke up, I couldn't find her house anymore, just found myself lying in the middle of the road." After Huan finished his story, everyone laughed and thought he was joking to scare them. However, Tien didn't mention anything about this matter. He just remained silent for a moment and then suddenly said, "There are 4 more people coming back to find you. We have to wait for them before we can continue. They probably won't be back fast tonight, so let's find a nearby empty space and camp here for the night." Apologizing, Huan scratched his head and said, "I'm sorry for making everyone suffer like this. Otherwise, the whole group would have been able to sleep in a warm guest house tonight." Tien didn't say anything, just turned his head to find a camping spot. Seeing this, Lian encouraged Huan. "Don't worry, Huan. When people go on adventures together, the most important thing is to support each other in times like this. What's there to feel guilty about?" Lian winked at Huan with an adorable look, then suddenly pointed to the red blanket Huan was holding and said, "Can I borrow it for a while? It's so beautiful." Huan froze for a moment, then understood Lian's intention and nodded, saying, "Sure. You can borrow it. Then return it to me later. I'll go set up camp with Tien now." After saying that, Huan went back to the car to get camping supplies and followed the direction Tien had just left to find a camping spot for the night. At this deserted bend, there was a spacious empty lot, near the edge of a deep, enticing abyss. The vast empty land stretched for hundreds of meters, suitable for the whole group to camp overnight. Although there were warning signs here, the area often had accidents involving vehicles, making it dangerous. However, backpackers ignored the warning signs and still often chose this place as a camping spot, mainly because the scenery here was beautiful. In the distance, across the horizon, was a white waterfall, below which was a deep blue abyss. On the ridge of the waterfall, the night sky was filled with bright stars, and the moon illuminated the entire valley, creating an extremely beautiful sightseeing spot. Moreover, despite the danger warnings and the many accidents here, they were all caused by vehicles plunging into the abyss, rather than any incidents on this empty land resulting in casualties. So backpackers camped here without fear. Continuously receiving the red blanket from Huan, Lian pressed it against her face and closed her eyes to enjoy it. She was so fascinated by the blanket. After thinking for a while, she suddenly came up with the idea of wanting to buy the blanket back from Huan. After Huan and Tien finished setting up camp, Lian had approached Huan and whispered in his ear, "Huan, this blanket is so beautiful. Can you leave it for me? I'll buy it at any price." Huan looked at Lian and smiled, saying, You're kidding, right? What's so special about this blanket that you like it so much? Leon stopped smiling, speaking firmly. I'm serious, Huan. I really like this blanket, or maybe you can sell it to me. Huan was taken aback, not expecting Leon to have such thoughts. But since Leon liked the blanket, Huan also liked it very much. He had to try hard to get it. At least that's how it seemed in his imagination. Huan had never thought of selling this blanket to anyone, but now that Leon was asking to buy it, he was in a dilemma. While he was still hesitating about how to respond, the sound of a motorcycle engine revving loudly was heard. A man with a scruffy beard appeared at the end of the deserted road bend. As soon as the backpacking group saw him, they immediately guessed who he was. It was Hung, the first person Tien had sent to find Huan. Seeing Huan return, his car parked in the empty lot, Hung breathed a sigh of relief. Getting off the car, he walked over to Huan's place, jokingly scolding. Kid, how many times have you wandered around this boulevard? With no phone signal, I was worried you might be dead somewhere. Hearing Hung laughingly say that, Huan scratched his head and laughed, saying, I'm sorry for making everyone suffer because of me. Hung laughed, not agreeing with that, saying, You consider me an outsider again? Then suddenly Hung turned to look at Leon, seeing Leon holding the red blanket tightly. He found it strange and asked, Leon, why are you holding onto that blanket? Where did you find it? Why haven't I seen it before? Can you show it to me? Hung reached out for the blanket from Leon's hand, and Leon was slightly stunned but reluctantly handed the blanket over to Hung. While handing over the blanket, she felt a little reluctant. Seeing Hung's curiosity, Huan explained, It's because of this blanket that I made everyone suffer like this. I found it on a trail, in a house belonging to an ethnic woman. Taking the blanket from Leon's hand, Hung nodded and almost rubbed it, saying, Yeah, this blanket is really beautiful. I've never been interested in these flashy things before, especially blankets and pillows, but this one is too beautiful. Maybe my wife at home will like it. Or maybe you can leave it for me. While holding the blanket and rubbing it, Hung became more and more fascinated by the smooth fabric. He joked, Wow, this is still Huan's thing, right? Whoever Huan sells it to, I'll buy it. What does Huan need it for when it's so colorful like this? Hearing Hung and Leon vying back and forth, Huan laughed bitterly, not knowing what to say. After a while, the other 3 people sent to find Huan also returned. They followed Hung's car trail and were immediately drawn to the allure of the blanket, which seemed to be like a magical force. In the end, no one managed to buy the blanket, and Huan didn't agree to sell it. So everyone felt resentful, returning to their respective tents and still harboring grievances, not speaking to each other. As the team leader, Tien had to stand up several times to mediate before things smoothed over. However, everything was accompanied by uncomfortable glances and, most of all, everyone's eyes longing for the red blanket in Huan's hands. The night stretched across the mountains, the beautiful scenery sweeping through the stunning land. But in the group, most people no longer had the mood to enjoy the beautiful scenery while backpacking. All the psychological developments of everyone seemed to have changed drastically since the appearance of that red blanket. It became the focal point of all troubles. That night was a long, dreadful night, and also a night of horrifying bloodshed. After casually having dinner, everyone returned to their respective tents. Some people sneaked over to meet Huan, secretly discussing buying the blanket to gain an advantage over others. The greedy souls began to calculate, and Huan, standing in the middle, always had to bear the brunt. One such person was Tone, a young engineer 2 years younger than Huan. After having a casual dinner, Tone sneaked from his tent to Huan's tent to talk. Tone sat at the edge of the tent, asking Huan to borrow the red blanket to keep warm. Tone, who is only 24 years old this year, unmarried and still single. Tone always wants to have a companion and live a lifetime with someone. When Tone touched the red blanket, he always felt like he was touching the flesh of a woman, unable to resist. It's as if just having this blanket, Tone could have someone to cuddle with every night, fulfilling his desire for companionship. Therefore, Tone's greatest desire at the moment is to be able to buy that blanket from Huan. Tone is obsessed with the blanket. Tone draped the blanket over himself, almost constantly rubbing it, initially speaking calmly to Huan. But in the end, Tone only focused on rubbing and stroking the blanket as if caressing a woman and ignoring Huan altogether. Seeing Tone cuddling the blanket and about to stand up to return to his tent, Huan immediately asked for the blanket back. Okay. Can you give me back the blanket? Tone, lost in the blanket as if in a trance, suddenly came to his senses, showing some remorse but still regretfully said, or maybe you can lend it to me for tonight, and I'll return it to you tomorrow morning. Huan shook his head and said with a laugh, you're joking, just give me the blanket so I can go to sleep. Tone hesitated to give it back, making Huan blush with embarrassment as he stood up to insist. Initially, the two conversed politely, but eventually Huan got irritated and started raising his voice at Tone. The two began to argue, drawing the attention of the whole group. Khan was the first to rush over, seeing Tone struggling with Huan, and immediately shouted, Tone, let go of the blanket and give it back to Huan. Why are you acting like a thief? Tone arrogantly replied, I only want to borrow it for one night, and he won't even lend it to me. Not only that, he's also yelling at me. I won't give it back. Let's see what he can do. Huan also raised his voice. Damn it, I've been patient with you so many times, but you still don't get it. If you don't know shame, let me teach you. Huan rushed forward, delivering a punch like a thunderbolt to Tone's head. Infuriated, Tone also punched back, throwing the blanket aside and engaging in a fistfight with Huan. The group descended into chaos, with some cheering excitedly while others intervened. In the midst of the chaos, accusations flew. Huan and Tone eventually calmed down and made peace with each other. But when Huan returned to his tent, he found the red blanket missing and asked around, but no one admitted to taking it. Tone, having been punched by Huan, couldn't be the one who took it. Huan felt resentful for losing the blanket, and suspicion arose among the group. Especially those who had intended to buy the blanket from Huan felt even more regretful and began to accuse each other. First, Hung approached Lian and said, Lian, tell me the truth, did you steal the blanket while Tone and Huan were fighting? You like that blanket the most, so if it's not you, who else could it be? Lian, feeling insulted as a woman, retorted angrily. Hung, what are you saying? You're accusing me of stealing. I think you're the one who did it. Look at you, with your messy beard and thug-like appearance. You're a man, strong like that, and you joined in taking the blanket while the two were fighting, right? Tell the truth, don't be a thief and then act innocent. Hung glared angrily, always hating being accused of being a thief. Because of his innate appearance, he couldn't change it, and people shouldn't judge someone's character based on appearance. Yet Lian called him a thief and even portrayed him as a robber, which made Hung even more furious, like pouring fuel on a fire. Wham! Hung rushed forward, grabbing Lian by the hair and delivering a thunderous slap to her face. At the same time, Khan also angrily searched the campsite for the missing blanket but found nothing. Khan, frustrated, turned back to Huan and accused loudly. Huan, did you hide the blanket to prevent people from asking to buy it? You did that and caused internal discord among us due to suspicions of theft. I've checked everywhere except your tent. It must be there. Hearing Khan's accusation, Huan, already upset about losing the blanket, felt even more despondent. He suddenly erupted in anger, rushing forward to grab Khan by the collar and punching him repeatedly in the face, shouting, Damn it, I still have that blanket, why would I need to hide it? It's mine, I can sell it to whoever I want, and if I don't want to, what's the problem? Why would I need to hide it? Seeing the chaotic and aggressive scene, Tien, as the group leader, had to intervene and calm down each group one by one. First, he had to settle the dispute between Hung and Lian, intervening as soon as possible because Hung had beaten Lian bloody, her hair falling out in clumps. Then it was Huan's turn, as he had also knocked Khan unconscious. Tien had to mediate until midnight before things calmed down somewhat. Everyone felt resentful and retreated to their tents to sleep. But things didn't stop there. Right at midnight, a horrifying sound rang out, screams echoing like someone's throat was being slit. Everyone woke up to see Lian emerging from Hung's tent, her face covered in blood. In her hands was the red blanket, and she screamed. It was him who took it. I found it in his tent. The vile scoundrel, he deserves to die like this. After saying that, Lian looked around fearfully, as if afraid someone would try to steal the blanket from her. So she rushed out, jumped on her motorbike, and sped away with the red blanket. Khan and Tone both shouted, "Damn it, that woman just killed someone and stole the blanket. I have to chase after her to get it back." Then both of them, one after the other, got on their motorcycles and chased after Leon. The remaining people in the group were stunned by Hung's horrifying death and Leon's overly aggressive actions over a small disagreement. No one would have thought that just because of a blanket, so many things could happen. As everyone stepped into Hung's tent, they saw his neck had been severed, blood flowing freely. His beard was soaked with blood and water, as he had vomited before dying, a mix of water and blood. Hung's terrifying eyes widened with horror, as he couldn't believe that Leon could do such a thing to him. Suddenly, a loud explosion caught everyone's attention. On the other side of the road, through the darkness of the cliff's edge, a motorcycle burst into flames with a terrifying scream piercing the night, a person thrown from the bike, plummeting into the abyss. Moments later, at the bend of the road, the motorcycle's headlight reappeared. Khan, exhausted, his disheveled hair blowing in the wind, turned his bike around, clutching the red blanket tightly. Stopping, he stood in the middle of the road, shouting triumphantly about his achievements. He said, "It's terrible. That girl forced Tone off the cliff, making him plunge. I chased her to retrieve the blanket, only for her to escape. She won't escape prison." After speaking, Khan laughed heartily, tossing the blanket aside and calmly walking back towards the vacant lot. But just then, from the hillside, a truck suddenly appeared, speeding through the night. Honk! The sudden, prolonged sound of the horn, the driver's startled exclamation as he slammed on the brakes, but too late. Khan's body was suddenly crushed by the truck, his head smashed, unrecognizable. People gasped in horror at the rapid turn of events. The accident occurred just a few meters from the warning sign. The red blanket flung aside, along with Khan's body lying under the wheels less than half a meter away. Wails and cries echoed, sending shivers down everyone's spine. The truck's horn continued blaring, unable to be silenced. Even the driver was terrified, not understanding why someone was standing in the middle of the road at night. Due to the late hour, he had recklessly sped through the deserted road, unaware of the consequences. As each horrifying event unfolded, starting from the moment Huan brought the red blanket. By now, Tien couldn't remain silent any longer. He gathered everyone together and looked to Huan to explain. "When I first saw the blanket and heard your description of how you obtained it, I knew it could be the same as the one in a mythical document. I didn't believe it was true, but..." Since Huan had already retrieved the red blanket from the roadside, he listened to Tien's analysis while clutching it in his hands. Hearing Tien's words, many became curious. Hoa, a middle-aged woman, asked, "What do you mean, Tien? What's that myth you're talking about? Can you explain it clearly?" Tien nodded solemnly. "Of course. But before I tell the story, I have a small request." "Huan, can you burn this blanket?" Huan shook his head, firmly holding the blanket, refusing Tien's suggestion. Tien sighed reluctantly. There was no other option but to recount the tale in detail. That document was in a Russian book, detailing an expedition of the late Qing dynasty of China exploring this country. They discovered a similar blanket owned by a Miao woman in Yunnan. Almost the entire expedition died, the sole survivor recounting how he stumbled into a world of demons. The Miao described it as a demon dynasty, existing parallel to the real world. Every 100 years, a red blanket appeared, claiming lives to satisfy the bloodlust, opening the gates to the demon dynasty. Afterwards, chaos ensued, and the bones were collected to build a castle. When the castle was complete, the demon queen would be resurrected, marking the end of a civilization. This legend was recounted by the Miao, confirmed by the expedition. It was ridiculed, considered forgotten lore. Tien concluded. Unexpectedly, something from Miao legend appeared before me. The story explains why the Miao people dispersed across various countries. It's because of that demon queen's resurrection. After Huan's account, Tien, visibly alarmed, stood up. "Huan, if what you're saying is true, then I've seen the bone castle." Tien's face turned pale, and Hoa asked, "Why is that?" Tien replied, "If what he says is true and he saw the bone castle, then disaster is imminent." But Huan laughed. "Don't worry, Tien. When I said I saw it, it was probably just a hallucination. It seemed that I destroyed it myself, as it shattered into dust when I touched it. Tien shook his head. We can't underestimate hallucinations. If it opened, it means the gateway to the real demon dynasty exists. If that's true, burning the blanket won't help. According to the expedition, it will reappear. The only way is to return it to its original place. Or more precisely, throw it back into the gate to permanently seal it. We must act fast, or everyone will die. Who? A young man in the group chuckled. Oh, Tien, you're just kidding. These accidents are just coincidences. You shouldn't stress over them. In my opinion, we need to report this to the authorities. 3 deaths aren't simple. We need to inform the police to catch Lian. She's gone mad. Who knows what other foolish actions she might take. Tien disagreed, saying, Fine. If you don't believe me, we'll split into 2 groups. One will go back to Nam Nun town to report to the authorities. The other will go with me and Huan to where he found the blanket and return it. Everything needs to be resolved quickly before dawn. After Tien's analysis, more than half of the group agreed, splitting into 2 teams. One followed Hu, the other followed Tien. Tien's group consisted of Huan, Hoa, and Duke. Hu's group included Luong, Tru, and Gia. The 2 groups split up, each heading in opposite directions from the bend in the road. They had about 3 more hours until dawn. Everything needed to be done quickly before sunrise. As Tien said, if they didn't resolve the red blanket quickly, the death toll would continue to rise. According to Huan's account, they quickly found the path he had wandered down, about 30 minutes into their journey. The narrow road hid behind a large birch tree. In the distance, they could see the lush cornfields. The night sky was dark, so they couldn't see the cornfields clearly, only hearing the rustle of the wind through the long stalks. The small path led deep into the densest part of the mountain. At first, they saw a few villages, but deeper in, only scattered houses remained, solitary on the hillside among the cornfields. Further in, only the huts used for guarding the fields stood, leaning crookedly as if abandoned long ago. Finally, Tien's group found the end of the road. Just as Huan described, at the end of the path was indeed a small house, eerie like a haunted house. The house faced the end of the path, with no other way behind it. The group halted in front of the house. Tien parked the car and turned to ask Huan, Are you sure you got this blanket from here? Huan nodded confidently, pointing. I'm sure. This blanket was hanging on that fence over there. I took it down myself and went into that house, where I met a tribal woman and asked to buy this blanket from her. Tien furrowed his brow, feeling strange. If the blanket was obtained so easily, where did the gateway to hell come from? Finally, Tien nodded. All right. Let's all go in and ask a few questions. Someone stay back to watch the car. Huan, Tien, and Hoa entered the small house. The scene was the same, no lights were on, and the tribal woman sat in a corner, chewing on something, drooling it down like a viscous, smelly, slimy substance. The woman had a scarf covering half of her face, leaving only a gaping mouth chewing on a piece of meat with bones protruding. Hoa couldn't bear it and vomited on the spot. Only Tien remained calm, shining his flashlight towards the woman and calmly asking, Are you the owner of this blanket? Tien gestured towards the blanket that Huan was holding. The woman began to speak, and as she did, a foul stench started emanating. Her language was in a tribal dialect, incomprehensible to everyone except Tien. Tien listened intently, furrowing his brow. After a while, Huan turned to ask, What did she say, Tien? Tien explained, I don't understand much of her language, but her meaning is clear. She said that whoever stole this blanket without her father's consent will have to sell their soul to the demon. Huan quickly replied, I didn't steal it, I asked to buy it, but she refused to sell it. When I woke up, she was gone, so I couldn't return it. I didn't do anything wrong. Tien nodded in agreement. Yes, she also said that you're not a thief because she intentionally gave it to you. The real thief who sold their soul to the demon is the one who stole the blanket from you. Huan was shocked, then stuttered. The thief who stole my blanket? Isn't it hung? He's already dead. Tien nodded and turned to explain to the tribal woman. She shook her head and replied in her native language. After hearing her response, Tien analyzed for Huan. She said the one who sold their soul to the demon hasn't truly died yet. Only when that person dies can you return the blanket to her and end everything. Huan furrowed his brow, pondering for a moment, then asked, "Did you ask her who she is and how she knows all this?" Tien said, "She's one of the last descendants of the old Miao shaman. She's tasked with guarding this red blanket. But when you took it, she knew she couldn't stop you because of a prophecy. Whoever takes the blanket will find a way to break the curse of the red blanket." Huan nodded and said, "Okay, let's think about it. According to what she said, there really is someone who sold their soul to the demon. So who could it be?" Tien pondered for a moment, then said firmly, "It could be Lian, or it could be Tone." All three in the room were stunned, and Hoa said, "But Tone died in the gorge. Khan himself said so." Tien shook his head. "Not necessarily. Khan was possessed by the demon at that time, he was just lying. We don't know for sure if the person who fell down the cliff was Lian and not Tone." Hoa was amazed by Tien's speculation and asked, "So where did Tone go?" Tien shook his head again. "I don't know, but I'm sure we need to find both of them now." Suddenly, the tribal woman spoke up again. Tien became even more convinced that his speculation was correct. He said, "She noted that the one who sold their soul to the demon is actually a man." All three agreed that it could very well be Tone. Then they began to turn back to the cars, intending to return to the old campsite area to search for clues about Tone. But when they returned to where the cars were parked, they were surprised to find that Duke was missing. They split up to search for him, but no matter how hard they looked, they couldn't find Duke anywhere. In the end, Tien chose to stay and search for Duke, leaving Huan and Hoa to return to the campsite area to look for Tone. Huan and Hoa agreed, and both drove back to the old location like mad. An hour had passed since they arrived here, and there were only 2 more hours until sunrise. They had to quickly return to the campsite area and determine if Tone was really the one who sold his soul to the demon. If so, they had to kill him immediately. When they returned to the campsite area, they indeed found Tone there. His face was scratched and covered in blood, his eyes wild and looking like a lost soul. Huan approached Tone and exclaimed, "Tone, are you really not dead?" Tone was surprised and turned to ask Huan, "Where did everyone go? Why is no one here? Is that Khan's body over there? Why did he die so tragically like that?" Huan didn't explain but continued to ask Tone, "Tone, where is Lian? Did you really kill her?" Tone shook his head and said, "I didn't kill her. She pushed me off the cliff, but I survived." Then she drove the car back to the campsite area. "Didn't anyone see her?" Huan was shocked and turned to ask Hoa, "Did she really drive back on this road? Why didn't I see or hear her car?" Tone smirked faintly. "Don't you know? Her car is very modern, she can turn off the engine and lights when needed. She just had to turn off the lights and engine when she passed this area." "Didn't Khan tell you before he died that she had come back?" Hoa said, "No." Huan nodded, analyzing. "It's possible that when we were carrying Hung's body into the tent, no one paid attention to the road, so she managed to escape. Moreover, Khan died too quickly, so he didn't have time to tell us about it." Hoa nodded in agreement. That could be it, but at this point, both of them seemed to understand each other without saying a word. Both exclaimed in horror, "Oh no, the woman in that house. It could really be her." Both of them were terrified, suddenly fearing for the lives of Tien and Duke at this moment. Tone, curious, turned to them and asked, "What's wrong with you two?" Huan explained, "Lian, she tricked us. She disguised herself as an old tribal woman and lied to us that you were the one who sold your soul to the demon. She wants to separate us all individually and then kill us one by one." Tone suddenly stood up, angry. "She's where? I have to beat her up for what she did. She's the one who killed Hung, indirectly caused Khan's death, and almost killed me by pushing me down the cliff." Huan looked at his watch, frowned, then urgently said, "We have 2 more hours until sunrise. According to Tien, once it's dawn, we won't be able to find that house anymore." After Huan finished analyzing, all three hurriedly got on their motorcycles to return to the place where Huan said Lian might be. The 3 individuals raced back to the location of that house after a while. And at that very spot now, the three horrifiedly realized a dreadful truth. Hanging from the wooden beam of the house was a decapitated head swinging back and forth. And the wind was gently swaying the head with its tongue lolling out, like an eerie musical score in a church. That decapitated head, none other than belonged to Duke. Huan nodded, affirming, "Our speculation was correct. She's truly here." Hoa, panting heavily after vomiting, regained her composure and suddenly asked, "Where's Tien?" Huan furrowed his brows, waved his hand, and said, "Come on, let's go inside and search thoroughly." The three cautiously stepped into the house. Inside the house, none of them saw the indigenous woman who had been sitting there as usual. Instead, they only saw a man tightly bound, his mouth gagged, whimpering in a corner. That man was Tien. All three were terrified. Tone rushed to rescue Tien, but Tien kept shaking his head and whimpering, signaling Tone not to come closer. Ignoring Tien's warning, Tone still stepped closer. Then, just 3 steps away, Tone's entire body stiffened, frozen in place. Tone was dead. A wooden stake pierced through his head, and beneath his feet was a wooden trap. If he stepped on it, a wooden stake would shoot through his head. Even if it missed and went downward, Tone would still die. It was Duke who tried to stop Tone, but Tone still walked forward and ultimately paid the price with his own life. Disaster. Suddenly, a sinister laughter echoed in the night. Huan and Hoa immediately turned back to where the laughter came from. Huan spotted, behind the cornfield, the silhouette of a girl with disheveled hair lurking, sometimes appearing and disappearing behind the cornstalks. Ignoring the shadowy figure, Hoa turned to Tien and asked, "How can we save him? Can we get through now?" Tien nodded continuously. Huan and Hoa assumed there was no longer any danger, so they went to untie Tien and rescue him. After a while, Tien's ropes were all removed. He breathed heavily, gasping for air, then spoke as if nothing had happened. "It's Lian, she hasn't died." Huan and Hoa nodded. Huan asked, "So, what should we do now? Should we kill her?" Tien said, "She's the key. Once we catch her, wrap the red blanket around her and burn it, right here. Then we can end this nightmare." Huan nodded and suddenly curiously asked, "Why did you let her catch you? Where's the indigenous woman? Could she be Lian disguised?" Tien shook his head and said, "The story is quite lengthy. First, we have to catch her." Huan nodded and told Hoa, "You and Tien stay here and rest while keeping an eye on the vehicles. Let me chase her down." Tien objected. "No. Let me go with you." Huan said, "I won't be at ease leaving just Hoa here. Let me handle this alone." After saying that, Huan rushed outside and plunged into the bushes. He followed the trampled cornstalks, and eventually, he saw Lian's fleeting figure behind a clump of cornstalks. Huan crouched like a tiger, waiting for a moment before pouncing with a firm grip. His body lunged towards her, capturing Lian tightly. Lian struggled, wanting to escape. But her weak and powerless body couldn't do much. She tried to scream but couldn't. Huan held her tight and dragged her back to the house. On the way back, Huan noticed Lian was constantly shedding tears. She was crying, and Huan found it somewhat puzzling. After capturing Lian, Huan escorted her into the wooden house and said to Tien, "I caught her, but where's the red blanket? We need to hurry. It's almost dawn." Tien nodded and said, "Okay. Let me go back to the car and get it. I left it there. You keep her here." Saying that, Tien turned and ran outside. Huan, catching his breath after the pursuit of Lian, now noticed Lian had been injured in the leg. Somehow, he was able to catch her so easily. After thinking for a moment, he suddenly remembered Hoa. Not seeing her anywhere, he looked around. And he was horrified to find Hoa hanging from a noose in a dark corner of the house. At this moment, he realized a horrifying truth. He shouted, "Tien, are you the one who sold your soul to the devil?" Startled, Huan released Lian and turned around, but at that moment, a heavy object struck his head. Huan fell to the ground, blood gushing out, and at that moment, the figure of the murderer appeared. Tien chuckled and said, "Yes, I stole that red blanket and framed Hung. Fool. Didn't you hear that old woman say that the one who sells their soul to the devil is a man?" Now only Lian and Tien were left alive. Lian looked at Tien with fear. She had been tongueless since when Tien. Approaching Lian, Tien gently stroked her head and said, "The show is over. You are all just sacrifices for the blanket. Just a few more people, and the ceremony will end." Tien's laughter echoed chillingly in the night, while an indigenous old woman slowly ascended from the underground chamber. She slowly dragged each corpse down into the cellar, then meticulously butchered the meat for consumption. Meanwhile, Tien pulled out an identity card from his breast pocket, tearing it up. He turned to look at Lian with a cold gaze. A choked cry rang out like a slaughtered pig in the night. The girl collapsed. Lian had been killed by Tien. 3 months later, at the end of a small dirt road, a man idly drove his car into the narrow lane. As if bewitched, he automatically wanted to explore the alleyway. When he reached the end of the narrow dirt road, he suddenly noticed a red blanket draped over the fence surrounding a house. He exclaimed excitedly, "Oh, such a beautiful blanket. I have to go in and ask if I can buy it." The end.
Hopefully the content has brought you interesting and meaningful moments. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the Ghost Stories YouTube channel to follow the channel's next videos. See you in the next video. Have a good day.